So we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentations. Our first presenter is Elise LeCompte. She's the Registrar and Assistant Department Chair at the Florida Museum of Natural History. Elise is going to be talking to us about access and use from the museum point of view. And then once Elise is done, we're going to take back presenter controls over here in Bradenton, and Stephanie Antoquino will be talking about the archive side of the house. So without further ado, Elise, go right ahead.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be here with you today. Access to and use of any collection is totally dependent upon the museum's mission. You can see the Florida Museum of Natural History's mission statement here. We understand through research. We preserve by using nationally and internationally recognized collections management standards and best practices, which include regulations and guidelines related to access and use. And we educate by interpreting the collections and the knowledge gained about them through research. Museums do not exist in a vacuum. They are public trusts that are operated and maintained for the use and benefit of their audiences and communities. In order to fulfill their duties as public trusts, museums establish policies, regulations, rules, and procedures to guide their staff in their actions and operations. And whenever I say staff, I mean everyone that works at the museum, including volunteers and interns. An access and use policy, whether it is embedded in the collections policy or written as a separate policy, states to whom and under what circumstances access to the collections is allowed, and in what ways the collections may be used. Not only does the policy tell us what to do, but it also tells us what not to do, and therefore makes it easier to say no to unacceptable access and use. At the Florida Museum of Natural History, our access and use policy is part of our collections policy, as you can see here. It covers general access to collections, use of collections and exhibits, commercial use of museum collections, and destructive testing, among other things. Each division within the museum is allowed to set more detailed rules and procedures as long as they fall within the general regulations set in the collections policy. Including rules and regulations about access and use in the collections policy shows our public and our professional colleagues that we are acting as a public trust in their best interest. It demonstrates that the museum has made a commitment to its public as well as to the professional museum community to care for the collections according to professionally set standards and best practices. It also reassures donors that their gifts are being properly cared for and will it be available according to standardized guidelines that assure the long-term preservation of the gift. At the Florida Museum of Natural History, we use a form called the Collections Access Use Form, or what we refer to as the CAR, to record and track access to and use of the collections. This form is a 4-page document delineating information that we seek from the researcher or visitor, such as the purpose of his or her research or visit, and what exactly that person wants to do. The form also lists the museum's conditions governing access and use, as well as catalog information for the items being requested. The researcher has to agree that they will do only what they stated on the form and agree to the terms regulating access and use by signing the form. The collections manager and sometimes the curator in charge of the requested collection review the form and approve or deny the requested access and use. In certain cases, access and use of a collection, like our human skeletal material, for example, has to be approved by a special committee in addition to the collections manager and curator. This slide shows the pages of the CAR listing the conditions governing access and use and the table where we collect the catalog information for the requested objects. Museum collections are used for research, exhibit, and education. Decisions have to be made and codified about how we make our collections available for all of these uses. How do we make them available to the public in order to guarantee the long-term preservation of the collections? Do people have to make a special appointment to see or use collections in storage or even those on display? For example, if a researcher wants to take photographs or do testing on an object or specimen that is on exhibit, that involves exhibit staff as well as collection staff. It also involves time-consuming activities like opening the case, removing the object from its mount, taking the photograph or sample, returning the object to its mount, and closing the case. All of this takes time and extra labor. Who is allowed in the collection storage area? Does museum staff have to pull items and take them to a special area? How much staff time is required? Which staff need to be notified, just the collections managers or the curator as well? Will it take extra staff, as in the example cited above of the object on exhibit? How do we inform visitors and researchers that they need to make an appointment ahead of time to use the collections? This information may be posted on the museum's website, along with the conditions governing access and use. We sometimes have people call expecting to be able to come and see an object the next day. Sometimes people just show up at the front desk asking to see something. What procedures are in place to deal with these situations? How much supervision of the researcher is necessary, a minimum or a lot? This depends on several factors such as the sensitivity or rarity of the material and how much training the researcher has in terms of handling museum collections. In most cases, research should not be harmful to the objects or specimens being used. With certain activities like destructive testing, there may be minimal damage or even total destruction of an object or specimen. This is why destructive testing must be thoroughly vetted before it is allowed. Before approving destructive testing, we ask questions like, has the object been tested before? If so, how many times? Is it a rare specimen that should not be tested? How much of the object will have to be used? Just a small amount or the entire object? We then approve or deny the request based on the answers to these questions. Certain information should not be available to visitors and researchers. For example, donor names and contact information are not usually shared with non-museum staff. These days, there are more restrictions on confidentiality related to documents like medical or school records. We all know about federal and state privacy laws like those regarding HIPAA. These laws and regulations may affect how much access and use we are legally allowed to provide for some of the objects, specimens, and documents in our collections. Locations of field sites may be made available to researchers, but not to the general public. Such locations include archaeological or fossil sites and environmental locations of sensitive or rare species like certain orchids, for example. There may be embarrassing information contained in documents in your collection that heirs do not want made public. For example, a membership list or photograph reveals that Grandfather Oliver was a member of the KKK. There may be cultural restrictions for certain collections. For example, some Native American tribes have restrictions who can handle certain objects. In some groups, objects like medicine bags, pipes, or weapons should be handled only by shamans or males. At the Florida Museum of Natural History, we use two forms called the Technical Analysis Destructive Sampling Request and the Technical Analysis Destructive Sampling Agreement, or what we refer to as the TADS Request and Agreement, to record and track use of the collections in more detail than is recorded on the collection's access use form. The form is used to collect information such as the purpose of the analysis, the description of the procedure or test to be used, who will be performing the analysis if not the researcher, and whether or not the object will be damaged or destroyed, and if so, how much of the object will be left. The collections manager and sometimes the curator in charge of the requested objects or specimens review the forms and approve or deny the requested access and use. Again, use of a collection like our human skeletal material has to be approved by a special committee in addition to the collections manager and/or curator. And this slide shows the TADS request. The TADS agreement lays out the policy, rules, and regulations for analysis carried out on museums' objects or specimens. This slide shows pages 1 and 2 of the TADS agreement. The researcher agrees to abide by the policy, rules, and regulations, and that they will perform only the testing described on the TADS request by signing the signature page on the TADS agreement. As a public trust, one of the museum's main functions is to share the collections that they hold in trust for the public. One of the ways that they do this is through exhibits. As with acceptable research uses, the use of collections in exhibits should be laid out in the collections policy or in a separate exhibits policy. In writing the policy, museum staff needs to assess the types of exhibits that they want to have. For example, are there formal exhibits where objects and specimens are in locked cases? Are any objects such as sculptures or large pieces like cars, agricultural machinery, or tools displayed outdoors? Are objects loaned out or used in programs off-site? Do exhibits include hands-on or expendable education collections? If any object, specimen, or document is too fragile for display, should a copy or reproduction be used in its place? Perhaps the original might be on exhibit for a relatively short period of time, say a week or two for a special occasion like an anniversary of some historic event. Then a copy would be put in its place for long-term display. How long should an item be on display? Under what conditions should the item be displayed? Some textiles and documents need low light levels and/or should be displayed only for a small amount of time. How should items be mounted or secured and handled for their safety? Who has the authority to move and remove collections items? Is photography allowed? There are also issues related to public safety. The top photograph shows exhibit staff mounting the tusks on the mastodon that is on display in my museum's lobby. In mounting the tusks, we have to be concerned with the safety of the museum staff, the safety of the specimen, and the safety of the public, both during the mounting and while it is on exhibit. Of course, there are always issues to consider related to climate control. What relative humidity and temperature do the objects or specimens require? What kind and level of lighting is safe? In regards to security, the museum has to decide how the display cases are going to be secured, how objects and specimens openly displayed are going to be secured and protected, and what types of security to use, such as guards, cameras, or alarmed exhibits. Are there special requirements due to cultural or privacy issues? One of the exhibits at the Florida Museum of Natural History contains burial items from a prehistoric Native American site. These items are displayed in an alcove so that anyone wishing to prepare themselves in a special way before viewing the items can do so. Visitors also have to push a button to get the lights in the case to come on. Not only is this good for the preservation of the ancient wood, but it also allows visitors to view or not view the items as they see fit. Issues to consider when using collections for interpretation and education are similar to those for collections on exhibit. The public expects to see the real thing when they visit a museum. Therefore, it is preferable to display real objects. As I mentioned above, some objects and specimens are too fragile to be displayed, even on a short-term basis. In this case, museum staff may make the decision to use reproductions. Sometimes a museum may decide to use real objects for hands-on exhibits or programs, knowing that they eventually will be damaged or lost in the instance where they are deemed expendable. Teaching collections usually consist of real objects or specimens, precisely because they are for teaching. Decisions have to be made regarding the level of handling that these collections are exposed to. Are they handled only by the instructor, or are the students allowed to handle them as well? At the Natural History Museum, we have a lot of projectile points and potsherds without any provenience, which means that they have relatively little use for research. We use these objects in hands-on programs or for teaching collections. When it comes to unacceptable uses, there are definite warning signs. If you are uncomfortable about material being used in a certain way or for a certain purpose, then it is probably unacceptable or at least questionable. Sometimes the staff does not understand the difference between living history setups and actual exhibits. They might think that it is acceptable to use original artifacts to give demonstrations. Lynn Robertson, former registrar for the Museums and Historic Sites of the West Florida Preservation, Inc., caught a maintenance worker making his way to the collection storage area to get a certain sized wrench. He did not have the size he needed, and he knew right where he could get the one that he did need, in the collection storage room. Totally unacceptable. Another unacceptable use is when the staff loses all control over how an item is used. There are still photographs from a play that commemorated these are still photographs from a play that commemorated the 250th anniversary of General Bernardo de Galvez's success over the British in the Battle of Pensacola in 1781. The producers of the play asked if they could borrow historic objects from the West Florida Preservation, Inc.'s collection to be used as background on the set in order to lend authenticity to the scene. There was a solemn oath given that the objects would not be used or touched. You have to remember, however, that the actor has totally different priorities than the producers or directors. Chairs will get sat on. Actors will lean against desks or sometimes sit on them. The actor playing General Galvez actually stamped his foot on one of the historic tables. The museum had given the theater 3 tables for the set. One was a modern reproduction, one was a 50-year-old reproduction, and the other was an authentic 17th century table. You can guess which one the actor stamped his foot on. The actor also used an authentic early 18th century pitcher. He picked it up using just the handle, poured water out of it into a cup, and drank the water. Take note that the person who made the promise that nothing would be used or touched was not the person who was doing the acting, the touching, and the use. In this case, the museum lost control over use and care of the objects. Again, totally unacceptable. Sometimes collection staff may have little control over how an object is used, handled, and cared for. The furniture shown here comes from a collection of reproduction and original Spanish furniture. This furniture was donated to the Historical Society at a time when the Society had almost nothing. The first thing that the members of the Historical Society thought was, oh goody, we don't have to buy office furniture. We all know how much wear and tear office furniture gets and how much wear and tear and damage historic pieces used in public areas, such as a lobby, can get. We all have collection storage areas that are full to the brim. It might be tempting to place some of the collection's pieces in public areas like lobbies or gift shops. This is a very slippery slope. Not only are these pieces susceptible to damage by visitors, but non-collections museum staff may decide that it is all right to actually use the pieces. In the museum shop shown here, collections pieces were used as decoration on the top shelf behind the counter. Not only are these items susceptible to damage, for example, dust and excessive handling, but visitors sometimes think the items are for sale. If these items were on a rack or display case out in the open instead of behind the counter, visitors might even pick them up thinking that they are for sale. Volunteers or non-collection staff may consider the pieces as decor rather than as artifacts. You might come in to find one of the jugs filled with water and flowers. Brochures stored on top and inside this historic cabinet can cause abrasion and deterioration of the finish on the top, as well as wear and tear on the doors as they are opened and closed repeatedly to retrieve additional material from inside the cabinet. Sometimes people want to use the museum as background, either the exterior or interior, in photo shoots, videos, or films. In this case, the museum had to decide whether or not such use could harm the artifacts or building. It is essential to have a written contract for this kind of access and use. Safeguards can be written into the contract, including that a staff member must be present at all times and has the right to intrude and stop the session if the safety of the object or building is compromised. Users like film crews and casts must be bonded. Access and use fees should include fees for staff time, for the number of staff required, extra security, extra insurance, and the square footage needed. Be sure to include any extra space needed, like for dressing rooms, in the fees assessed for square footage. The fee structure may be different for nonprofits as opposed to for-profit organizations. If the activity interferes with the museum's open hours, it may affect the amount of money that the museum takes in via entry fees, or it may be simply inconvenient for the public, and the museum should be compensated for that. The extra money charged to the user could be used for other types of programming that would make the museum's collections available to the public in other ways. In this economy, we all know that museums are looking for ways to generate revenue. One popular way to do this is by renting the facilities for special events. This also requires a written contract and a special events policy. The contract and policy must lay out in explicit terms what the renters can and cannot do in your facility. The contract should describe if decorations may be used, and if so, what type and where they may be placed. You do not want decorations mounted to the walls with thumbtacks, nails, or staples. You may not want real candles to be used. You may not want the caterers to use hot plates. One of my colleagues mentioned that glitter can be a real problem as it is difficult to clean up. It is even difficult to get up off a bare concrete floor. In general, the basic ideas behind acceptable use are that the usage supports the museum's mission statement. The objects and specimens are appropriate for the use to which they are put, and they are appropriate for the desired audience, that the staff has control over how the objects and specimens are handled and used, and that necessary security, climate control, and lighting are provided for the objects and specimens. Basically, acceptable use should not give you that queasy feeling in the pit of your stomach that says that you are not in control over how the artifact is being used, secured, and cared for. If it does not feel right and it is not covered in a written policy, then it should be deemed unacceptable. If a request is made for use that the museum has never encountered before, explain that to the person or organization making the request and do lots of research. Check with other museums that have faced this same situation. Ask how they handled it and how it worked out. Check with regional and national museum organizations like AAM and AASLH to see if they have appropriate examples of policies that cover similar use. Then let the director, board, and collection staff make the decision about whether or not to allow it and how to handle it if the request is granted. There are various aspects related to reasonable access. When are museum facilities open to the public and to other visitors and researchers? The Exhibits and Education building of my museum is open on weekends and most holidays. However, the Collections and Research building is not open on weekends and holidays. Only rarely do we allow tours, visitors, or research on weekends or holidays in the Collections and Research building. In fact, only the lobby of the building is open to the public Monday through Fridays, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Visitors and researchers have to make an appointment and complete the paperwork that I talked about earlier to access the collections. Not only do museums have to abide by the Americans with Disabilities Act, they have an ethical responsibility to make their facilities and collections available to all their public. This includes making the facilities physically accessible. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990. Structures built before that time are grandfathered in unless they undergo renovation. However, many museums are trying to make their buildings more accessible, regardless of whether they existed before the passage of ADA. The photograph on the bottom left shows the Natural History Museum's Collections and Research building, which was built in 1970. It has no elevator, and up until the early 90s, there was no way for handicapped staff or visitors to reach the first and second floors, as they could be accessed only by stairs. Even the loading docks had only steps. In the early 90s, ramps were installed on the loading docks to make the second and first floors individually accessible. Many more museums are thinking about ways to make their content and collections more accessible intellectually through the use of braille signage, non-auditory visual aids, multilingual labels, and closed captioning for visitors and computer imagery. What do we do when it is really impossible to provide access to the collections? A site may not be physically accessible. An object or specimen may be too fragile to handle, display, or travel. There are many methods to make such collections available to the public. Video tours and documentaries can be created to make collections and exhibits available. This would be a good alternative for a historic house in which the second floor is not available to people who cannot climb stairs. For people who are interested in more detailed information about a particular object, specimen, or collection, the museum can create materials like read all about it books and pamphlets, or YouTube videos, or podcasts, or similar digital presentations. Digital and online access is now very popular. These techniques are becoming one of the main methods to make objects and specimens available to the general public, and in certain cases to researchers as well. For example, the Natural History Museum of American History, or the National Museum of American History, provides a downloadable 3D file of some of its objects that people can print out themselves if they have access to a 3D printer. Off-site displays and programs provide access for people who might not be able to get to the museum. There are respectful ways to provide access to culturally sensitive objects. I touched on this briefly earlier in the presentation. Museums should work with ethnic and indigenous groups to find the best methods for all people to access such collections. Confidential or private information can be redacted on a copy of the document. For collections with copyright restrictions, information can be provided to the user so that they can follow proper channels to get permission to use the object or document. Sometimes it is not safe to allow people to access or use certain collections. They may be hazardous, such as those objects that have been treated with arsenic. They may be inherently poisonous, such as medicine bottles containing poisonous substances, curare-tipped arrows, and jewelry containing poisonous seeds. They may be chemically dangerous, such as radioactive fossils or objects containing uranium, like Fiesta ware. In this case, reproductions can be used or access can be made available through digital or videographic means. In conclusion, written policies and procedures should be created to cover all forms of access, including photographs, photocopies, scans, and reproductions. It should be made clear to visitors and researchers whether or not taking photographs is allowed, especially when collections are on exhibit. It may not be legal to copy documents that are protected by copyright. What restrictions and rights do museums want to place on scans and reproductions, especially 3D scans and reproductions? As you can see, there is a lot to think about when deciding how to make your collections accessible and how to govern their use so that they are protected and well cared for. To reiterate, access to and use of any collection is totally dependent upon the museum's mission. It is crucial to establish written policies and procedures to regulate access and use. Access and use policies are often embedded in the collections policies. Finally, the basic tenets of access and use are that they support the museum's mission, that the objects and specimens are appropriate for the use to which they are put, that they are appropriate for the desired audience, that the staff has control over how the objects and specimens are handled and used, and that the necessary security, climate control, and lighting are provided for the objects and specimens. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Stephanie, who's collections manager at Planet Hollywood in Orlando.
Thanks so much, Elise. We're going to go ahead and switch around the presentation now. So everyone just give me 1 second. This is Robin. I think the whole thing that you were talking about, especially with the advent of 3D printers, is very interesting. Just how people are having to come up with different ways of viewing their presentations or their artifacts. Okay, so let me just double check. Okay, and we should be able to see Stephanie's presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to her. Just give me 1 second. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to discuss the library and archives point of view for access and use. which interestingly enough is not all of that different than for the museum point of view. One difference that is made is that it's divided between basically research and exhibit materials, and then those for interlibrary loan. So what's really, really awesome is that the Association of College and Research Libraries, in association with the Society of American Archivists, have created joint statements on both of these issues. And in doing so, they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just geared toward the special collections and archives world, that it can also be adapted and incorporated by museums and other repositories that hold any type of collection, really. So the joint statement on access to research materials in archives and special collections was approved in 2009. It discusses the repository's responsibility, intellectual accessibility, restrictions, policies, fees and services, citations, and copyright. So there is a lot more information online. And what's also really awesome is if you go to either SAA or the ALA website, you can find all of this information, and it's broken down into much more detail. But in creating your policies, it's a really valuable resource to use. So part of the responsibility of the repository is making sure that original research materials are available on equal terms of access, so that everyone is able to view these materials, and that there's access to all research materials, unless, of course, there's some type of restriction on those particular items. Intellectual accessibility, to inform the researchers in a timely manner about the collections and report the existence of the original research materials to anyone who might be interested. Restrictions deal with protecting the confidentiality and physical security of the items. Again, as Elise mentioned, there might be, Grandpa Joe was in the KKK, and that's something that you necessarily don't want to have out to the audience. So you want to make sure that any restrictions that are placed on your collection are adhered to as far as the research is concerned. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you have policies in order to protect and ensure future access. And you want to make sure that you're requiring the patrons to use your research materials according to published institutional policies. Fees and services, I know a lot of us are very familiar with this, whether we're in the museum world, the library world, the archives world. It could be fees for lending materials, fees for photo services, even just fees for making photocopies. You want to make sure that these fees are publicized and that you illustrate the reasons that you're charging them. And you want to provide reasonably priced reproduction services. One way that you can do this is if you want to search online for organizations of similar size and see what they charge for their photo service fees. When I was at the Orange County Regional History Center, we had to redo all of our photo fees for photo reproductions, and we found out that we were way overcharging in some areas and undercharging in some other areas. So it's really nice to go out there and just look at what other organizations are charging for their fees. Keep in mind that there is no obligation to provide the reproduction research services beyond those required by the policy. So if something's asking something that's not addressed, that's why we have these policies in place, so we can say, no, I apologize, but that's not something that we do. As far as citations are concerned, providing a suggested form of concise citation, crediting the repository, and listing the items used. So what is your accepted manner of crediting? And it could be different if it's an online source that is being used, for, or if it's in a book, or if it's within an exhibit. You want to make sure that you have that information cited in your policy as well. Copyright, of course, when is it the researcher's obligation in order to satisfy copyright law when copying or using the materials found in the collection? As far as the History Center's reproduction forms, our policies always stated that we might be providing you a copy of this photo, but if you're going to be using it, it is your responsibility to determine the copyright for that. And since we weren't necessarily the copyright holder, you do need to seek out that person if you feel that there might be some type of copyright infringement. One thing that I did is I went online and I found some examples of access policies, and I've included the web addresses for you so that you can go and take a look at them. And this is something that's really great for researchers so that if you have your access policies already online, researchers can go to your website and understand what is expected of them prior to visiting your site. And they may also find out, hey, I don't want to go there. I was just recently at an organization in Illinois that they don't necessarily allow researchers into their archives, but they do charge archives fees. So that could also keep you from making a wasted trip to some organization that has a closed door policy as far as coming in and doing the research is concerned. Here's another example from the Princeton University Library. Again, just this one is protected information, just giving you different examples. Art Institute of Chicago, so it's not just traditional archival repositories or libraries that we're thinking about. The Art Institute, this is their archives access policy as well. And also at the History Center, one of the things that we did is that we had our policy printed out, and at the end of it was a place for the researcher to sign. Any researcher that came into the reading room had to read this and sign it, stating that they understood and agreed to abide by all of the rules and that we had in place. And then those forms were kept in a binder so that we had proof that those individuals had actually read that in case something went crazy, which fortunately it never did. The Smithsonian Institution archives, you can see that there's policies are available online as well. And the reason that I included all of these is just so that you can see the different types of information that's put in there. And so again, when you're crafting your own access and use policies, it's really nice to go and take a look at the different varieties are out there. Some information may pertain to you where other information may not. And when we were discussing disseminating the information about in a timely manner about your collections, the University of Wisconsin Stout, they put on their Facebook page that this information was out about this new digital collection that they had. And within that, they had a link to an online article about that collection. So making sure that you are using social media to your advantage to advertise that if you have just digitized a collection or if a collection is now accessible, making sure that that is out there so that you are keeping your constituents aware of what's going on. The National Archives in St. Louis also put information on their Facebook page with a link to the National Archives site that discusses that particular collection. And then if any of you are on the ANA listserv, this just happened last week, Southern Oregon University sent out an email to the ANA list announcing the launch of their Stories of Southern Oregon with a description about how they came about the project, the information contained within the project, and then a link to it as well. Something else that's really great is Elise discussed your researchers and maybe not understanding how to handle collections. Harvard has a YouTube video about how to properly handle collections, which is really interesting and it's really well narrated. The University of Texas at San Antonio also has a special collections YouTube video on handling rare books. And what's really nice about theirs is that in addition to the narration, they also have text. So to make it really, so this is something that even if you don't have the money or the time or the resources to do this on your own, if this is something that you think is important, you can have these links available. And if you had, a common computer, this is something that you could require your users to view prior to actually having access to touching the materials. So something that's a little bit different is interlibrary loans. I know museums aren't really dealing with interlibrary loans. But again, the Association of College and Research Libraries with SAA have come up with the guidelines for interlibrary loans, and they also deal with exhibition loans for special collections materials. There are guiding principles to enhance the access, support research, and promote awareness of collections, supporting the needs of the researchers, and also benefiting the public by allowing these materials to be seen by individuals outside of the housing repository or the owning repository. Borrowing and lending institutions are sharing interrelated responsibilities for the care, handling, storage, and use management. And it's also a spirit of collaboration when you're approaching these loans, which is, I think, the way the museum world likes to approach it as well. So even though we're different, we're really not. So just the basic guidelines for borrowing and lending. And again, you can find the link to this information on either the ALA website or the SAA website. And it goes into a lot of detail. So developing, maintaining written policies and procedures, just as we've been discussing all along in this entire workshop series. Understanding the specific staff that is responsible for the related special collections, interlibrary loan, so that there are individuals who this is their responsibility and you know that it's your responsibility. So when something like this happens, you're not saying, who do I go to? And following clear and consistent communication and decision-making responsibilities. Guidelines for, continue with the guidelines for borrowing and lending, ensuring that the loan transactions are carefully, consistently, and thoroughly documented. Just like we've talked about before, we want to make sure that we have all of our paperwork and, sorry, there was noise here, I got distracted. Following organized workflows for managing those loan materials, secure and appropriate handling of environmental conditions. So when you lend out something, if it's something you don't want it to be touched by anyone, you want to make sure that they are using appropriate display cases and so forth. And then promoting access to special collections through the most suitable means. So is it a library, interlibrary loan, or is it an exhibition? There are some additional guidelines for borrowing. You want to make sure that you're documenting the receipt of the loan materials and noting any damaged information. What's really great about this particular policy online is that they have links to AAM's General Facility Report. They also have links to what should be included in your all of your documents and what type of information should you be recording and sample documents and so forth. So there's a lot of really great information available out in the web for this one. We're running short on time, so I know that you all can read this, so I'll just kind of go through it. Making sure that you have the authority to lend the requested items. If it's something that's on loan to your organization, you probably don't have the authority to lend it unless you have received permission from the lender that you are able to do that. And again, just as Elise was saying, make sure that you inform the borrowing institution of any legal requirements or restrictions that may be placed upon the items. Borrowing institutions have their own set of guidelines. Make sure that they're following the lender's policy and consulting with special collection staff when preparing the request, and adhering to loan periods and renewal request procedures. That way we don't come into that issue where we have abandoned property. The lending institutions, you want to make sure that you respond to your requests in a timely manner. You don't want a request for a loan to come in and then 3 months later you get it and then the organization needs it in a week. So again, I have some examples along with the links for online resources. University of Baltimore Archives, they have their outgoing loan policy for their archival materials on their website. Stanford University Libraries also has an exhibit loan policy. Oh, and that's it.
Hi everyone, this is Robin again. That was great information, and I'll say right now that I'll take, if Stephanie's good with it, I'll take all of her examples she put and all the things and put them on our online source so you guys can view all those sources. I think the point about having online access to the access policies is really important, and that makes sense to me because you want people to kind of see what you're doing as you're doing it. Like it's just a nice way to provide. And also you don't have those people. I mean, I know I've had cases where I've had people show up and appear in collections areas and kind of say, well, can I get into this? And I'm like, no. I'm like, it's sitting online. We said you couldn't. So it's nice. It's a good idea to make sure you have online access for it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and check in with everyone and see if there's any questions from any of our locations before we start the next bit of presentations. If our friends down in South Florida could jump on the mic to see if they have any questions, it would be appreciated.
Hi, Robin. No questions from us.
Great. And if the North Florida folks could jump on to let me know if they have any questions.
Hi, this is Laura. Linda Deaton had a question about, for Elise, about destructive use and exactly what does that mean?
Elise, could you hop on the mic?
Yes, I'm here.
I think Linda had a question.
So what is that her question? What does that really mean? Destructive testing?
Yes.
Okay. That's when we have an object like, say, a potsherd or even a piece of human bone where there's going to be a test done on it, such as radiocarbon dating or isotopic analysis. And in order to do that analysis, you have to destroy the sample that you take from the object or the piece of bone or whatever you're sampling. We do that with our natural science specimens too. So you are damaging the object or specimen to a certain degree, but if you review all the information about the test and what it's going to reveal, you've done that in an educated way, and it's going to lead to useful information so that you do go ahead and decide to damage or destroy that object. One thing we don't do is we do not use destructive testing on type specimens or rare specimens. Type specimens are those that, for example, a flower or a fish or something like that, or even a potsherd, it's the very first one that was found and described, and that's the type specimen, and a lot of museums have those collections. And I think that, I hope that answers the question.
That answered the question perfectly. Thank you very much. No further questions.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to go ahead and actually let me look on the over table here in Bradenton and see if anyone has any questions. Everyone's shaking their head. We do have Snooty in the room, the manatee, sadly, again, eating, so he's good. Yes.
Robin, this is Elise. I have one other thing I didn't mention during my presentation, that I am happy to share those forms with anybody. And in fact, I think I would be able to post them in the online community. Is that true?
Yeah, that was actually,
Okay.
Thank you for saying that, because I put a note to myself to ask you about that. Yeah, and this is true for anyone, at least those forms are great, or if anyone else has some forms that they've already developed that they feel comfortable enough to post to people, feel free to pass them along to me, because I'll post them on the online forum. Because again, most of these access and use things, it's like you don't need to reinvent anything. People have access and use forms kind of out the wazoo. So feel free to pass them along if you'd like to.